Now, what happens instead of the workers rising up and stealing the factory off the bourgeois governor? Instead, the German people rise up and steal the factory off the Jews.
Implying that even happened. Not only does TIK simply take Hitler's word for it that, oh yes, I'm a socialist because I said so, despite the fact that I disagree with every definition of socialism and I distance myself from all the other socialism, I'm somehow a socialist. He also simply accepts the Nazi mythology that, oh yes, the German people rose up and defeated the evil I don't know. That is part of the Nazi mythology, but that doesn't mean it's accurate. That never happened. That's not how Hitler got in power. Hitler had a small marginalized group that attempted a very, very unsuccessful putsch, a coup. It failed miserably. After that, when capitalism reached a crisis, a bunch of German and even foreign capitalists started giving Hitler millions of marks of money, of funding to campaign in elections. And he got like 30% in elections after he started getting all this funding and whatever. He became a pretty successful politician. People like huge weapons manufacturer Krupp, Hugo Stinnes, wealthy industrialist, owner of numerous coal plants, factories, his own newspapers, his own railroads. Fritz Thyssen, another wealthy industrialist, owner of the Thyssen conglomerate. Albert Vogler, owner of the United Steelworks. Adolf Kirdorf, another owner of steel plants and other kinds of industry. Kurt von Schroeder, a banker and investor, financier. There was a group of really rich people in Germany, including people like Hjalmar Schacht, the banker who supported Hitler but later had a falling out with Hitler. And this group became known as the Kepler Group or the Kepler Circle. It was led by Wilhelm Kepler, chairman of a IG Farben subsidiary. And this was a lobbying group, another group that started giving funding to the Nazis. Now, in 1932, when Hitler began to heavily focus on elections, before the 30s he was pretty marginalized, but this is when he really started getting a lot of money and he started doing good in elections.
Thyssen wrote a book called I Paid Hitler. The only man ever told the truth of the crowd. Now, Thyssen was Thyssen and the Krupps, these are the kind of people I'm talking about. Stinnes is the unknown man who was on the same rank, if not higher, than Thyssen and Krupp in those days. There was a general election in which they didn't collapse, but they suddenly fell, and the socialists took a big leap forward. I don't know which part.
1932.
Yes.
The Reichstag elections.
Yes, that was it. Now, I think this is the time when Thyssen and the rest must have had their meetings. The Schroeder banks and Thyssen and all the rest. Now, Stinnes also secretly was a big supplier of money for the Hitlerites. Stinnes, the richest man, I think he had 600,000 workers in his steel and coal plants. He also had an interest or owned 63 newspapers. He had a part interest in some of the four big banks. They were known as the D banks. The Dresdner Bank, there were four big banks. They were known as the D banks. He had an interest in that.
His backers are literally giving him millions of funding, and they own a shit ton of media. They own their own newspapers and everything. So in 1932, Hitler meets with the Kepler Circle and tells them, we need more funding, we need more money. Let's make this even bigger. And that is when the original Kepler Circle becomes what is more famously known as Circle of Friends of the Economy. And this group was much bigger. Quote, present were 67 members of the Circle of Friends, representing the most powerful industrial, political, and commercial interests of the Nazi power structure. Quote, it is estimated that at their disposal the Circle of Friends has some 800 million. So these are the people who helped Hitler come to power. It wasn't German people rising up. That's preposterous. And I'm sure people are gonna say, yeah, but didn't Hitler, restrict what the capitalists could do? And didn't he, crack down on some individual capitalists, especially Jewish ones? Didn't Schacht, the banker, himself have some kind of falling out with Hitler? Yes, but this is how capitalism works. You have the biggest capitalists. A lot of these guys, they had giant trusts and cartels and monopolies. Do you think they have some kind of problem with eliminating competition? Of course not. Krupp was the weapons guy closest to Hitler. And I'm sure in every other field, there was a small handful of capitalists who controlled that field, who were closest with the political establishment, the Nazis. So yeah, it was crony capitalism for sure. Capitalists were totally in cahoots with the politicians, and they were even eliminating competition and restricting competition and giving themselves favorable treatment by the government, subsidies and government contracts, and everybody else would go bankrupt. But that doesn't somehow make it not capitalism. Unless you're gonna cry, oh, but it wasn't real capitalism. Most of the time, that is how capitalism works. Collusion between the capitalists, the bankers, the industrialists, the financiers, collusion between them and the government is the norm in capitalism. So then, with all this money, Hitler gets elected chancellor. And then, his capitalist buddies, rest of the right-wingers in the government, they decide to carry out a real coup. The type of coup where one element of the government gets rid of another element of the government. So he orchestrates the Reichstag burning and he becomes Führer. They carry out a coup. There was no German people rising up. What are you talking about? Of course, he had some popular support, but this was not an anti-establishment revolution. This was a coup from elite sections of the establishment itself.
One's class, one's race, and that's it. The difference between Hitler's socialism and Marxist socialism.
Why do you make us go through this? Look, it's not just Marxist socialism. It's literally every kind of socialism except Nazism. Utopian socialism, meaning socialism that came before Marx, Marxist socialism, anarchist socialism, every other contemporary form of socialism, they all define socialism as societal ownership by the people who work. Nazism, it just wants an ethno-state, and that's it. Racial group in common control of the means of production. What common control? In Nazi Germany, the capitalists owned the means of production. They owned all the factories. The racial group, I'm assuming you mean Germans, they didn't all collectively own means of production. Only the capitalists owned the means of productions.
That's the fundamental ideological difference between Hitler's socialism and Marxist socialism.
We're not really even talking about the ideological difference. We're talking about simply the difference in economics. Look at socialist countries, look at their economy. They clearly have a socialist economy. Look at Nazi Germany, it clearly has a capitalist economy. It doesn't matter what they say, it doesn't matter what Hitler says. Just look at his economy. He has a capitalist economy. It doesn't matter how he rationalizes it.
Socialism is the state's control of the economy. It means transferring all power away from you, the private individual, to the group, the public state.
What does all power mean? State control means you give all the power to a state. First of all, I don't know about you, TIK, but I don't own any banks. I don't own any railroads or shipyards or mines. I don't own any factories. I work in a factory, though, but I don't own the factory. Somebody else owns it. But even that someone who owns the factory has to, follow certain rules and certain laws created by a state. Does that mean he has given power to the state? Or has he not given power to the state? What does all power mean? What if I can wipe my ass without asking permission from the state, but I can't flush the toilet without asking permission from the state? Does that mean that I have given some power to the state, but not quite all power? This is an incredibly terrible video. It's just a bunch of weird emotional appeals, really vague statements that don't mean anything. So far, there are no sources except Mein Kampf. Literally just, oh, Hitler said it, therefore it must be true.
And they justify this transfer of wealth and power by doing it in the name of the worker or the race or the nation if it's fascism, or the gender if it's feminism.
Oh my lord. Transfer of what? I already don't own massive wealth. It's not like everybody owned a factory and then the state took them all. No, most people don't own any factories. It's only a very tiny elite who owns factories. Normal people don't own factories. Normal people just work in them. No, we're stealing from the poor factory owners. How are they going to manage now if they have to work like the rest of us? How are they going to manage if we all own the factory together, if they can't be the sole exclusive beneficiary? But guys, we shouldn't support socialism because that means we have to give our factories away. Yeah, those factories we don't have, but don't worry about that. I just heard this from TIK. Billy, you would have to give your bank away, and Timmy, you would have to give your bank away, and Jimmy, you would have to give your bank away. What's that? You're saying you don't have any banks? Oh. Yeah, we don't have any banks. It actually would be in our interest if we all owned it together because, we're all working, we're all contributing, so shouldn't we, get together and decide? Isn't that what democracy is? No, I forgot. That would be evil, socialist, Marxist, murder and theft. What a scientific statement.
Power goes from the private individual to the collective group state.
What power? I don't have any power. Yeah, my power over my bank that I don't have goes to the collective that I'm a part of. Why doesn't anybody think of the rich guys? The rich man has been oppressed for too long. Somebody needs to stand up against those fucking masses. Somebody needs to start defending the rich elites, goddammit. The rich guys have worked hard getting inheritance, and these plebeians think that they should also have some control over the societal wealth. How dare they?
Socialism is the state.
Socialism is not the state. I don't know what you're talking about.
Hitler wanted to socialize the people. And do you want to know what you get when you abolish all the private youth organisations like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts and socialise the youth into the state? The Hitler Youth.
Isn't Hitler Youth just Nazi Boy Scouts? What are you even saying? What the hell are you even saying? It's just the Nazi youth organization. What are you talking about? I'm not even following at this point.
What about the abolishment of private trade unions and the socialisation of the workforce under one state trade union, the German Labour Front?
The Nazis banned other organizations and only allowed their organization. So, what is your point?
Both Lenin and Hitler abolished strikes because now that you're in a socialist paradise, the state is on the side of the workers, and so striking is not necessary.
You can say that striking is not necessary, and I understand that the Soviet Union said that they support the workers, and therefore it would be better if they didn't strike, and if they just brought up their grievances and then negotiated. That makes sense up to a point. But, for example, if you look at my video, Socialism versus Individualism, in that, I mentioned strikes that happened during Lenin's government, and yeah, there were strikes. There were numerous strikes, because the country was going through a civil war, there was a lack of food, generally pretty bad conditions, during the Russian Civil War, so some people were striking.
Quote, many of the strikes in 1920 followed traditional patterns and initially represented reaction to harsh material circumstances, rather than a protest against Communist Party labor policies. But food shortages could easily lead to attacks on the government trade monopoly or abuses. In December 1919, a representative of the Moscow Department of the Metal Workers Trade Union reported that the catastrophic sharpening of the food supply crisis has led to a spontaneous halt to work by workers and the calling of general meetings. February and March, when food supplies were particularly tight, constituted one peak of unrest, even though the food supply apparatus worked more effectively than in previous winters. Moscow experienced drastic problems with shortages, and as the situation deteriorated, discontent amongst workers escalated. At the end of March, the Moscow Communist Party newspaper published an editorial which noted that, in the past days in Moscow, here and there, from time to time, strikes have broken out in individual enterprises. These strikes are connected with the severe food supply situation of the workers." Unquote.
And you know what? Most of those strikes ended up with the state agreeing to the workers' demands, either fully or partially.
Quote, 86.3% of strikes had economic motives and only 13.7% political. The overwhelming majority of strikes, 73.9%, were classed as having been settled completely or partially in the workers' favor." Unquote.
So, not only were there strikes, but usually the workers won. These claims you're making, they're just ignorant. They're just simply ignorant.
What about a centralized state plan of the economy similar to Stalin's 5-year plan or Mao's Great Leap Forward or any socialist central plan in history?
So, okay, Hitler had a 4-year plan. Whoop-de-doo. So did India. So did South Korea. Are they socialist? Please don't tell me you think South Korea and India are also socialists.
In 1983, Ronald Reagan said to the members of the South Korean National Assembly that their country's economic success was due to having a free economic system. As Reagan was uttering these words, South Korea was implementing its 5th 5-year economic and social development plan. To add to this, there was extensive state ownership in key strategic areas of the economy. Now it is clear that Reagan was of course wrong when he claimed South Korea had a free economic system. So what kind of system was it then? Was it socialist? Definitely not. It was not even social democratic. It was state-directed capitalism, an economic system that had been favoured previously in Imperial Japan and adopted by other Asian tigers, such as Taiwan. So in South Korea, the state, headed by a military dictator, told private capitalists what kind of factories were to be built and where. However, in exchange, the state would provide these same capitalists with massive state support in the form of subsidies and monopoly privileges over certain areas of the South Korean domestic market. What also helped the owners of these massive conglomerates was the state's repression of workers' rights, which allowed these companies to make higher profits.
Wages were kept down. Free trade unions couldn't operate. In thousands of noisy, ill-ventilated sweatshops, Korean workers toiled long hours a day making shoes, textiles or wigs for export.
It should be noted that South Korean dictator Park Chung-hee was a big supporter of class collaboration and believed that everyone should work towards the same goal. When Park Chung-hee came to power in 1961, the first thing he did was to nationalize the banking system. These banks were nationalized so they could give low-interest loans to massive private companies in order to help them grow. Poryang Steelworks was used to provide steel for domestic companies at below export prices. These state-owned companies and industries were there to help the growth of private capitalism.
The thing is, there are different kinds of plans. These supposed economic plans that capitalist countries have had, such as Nazi Germany, South Korea, India, they are very, very different sorts of plans. Whereas in a socialist country like the Soviet Union, they could actually plan the entire economy, more or less, considering that they only have the state sector and the collective farm sector, and everything else is minuscule. So they can plan the state sector exactly how they want, and they can more or less plan the collective farm sector. Since it doesn't belong to the state, it's a little bit different, but, it's still within the socialist sector, so they can plan it. But within a capitalist country like South Korea, for example, all they can do is they can plan the state sector up to a point. It's still functioning within capitalism, but they can plan how the state sector is going to function in capitalism. They can basically make rough outlines of what they're going to do, what they're going to focus on with the state budget and everything. And when it comes to the rest of the economy, all of the private economy, they can just regulate it. They can even make very extreme regulations, but they're still going to end up only regulating a capitalist economy, which is what South Korea did. That is not socialism, and that's not even really planned economy. Maybe you can call it a command economy, maybe. A command economy is basically what Nazism had. It's the type of capitalist economy where the state just tells the key sectors what to do. Pretty much all capitalist countries implemented the command economy during World War II, because, it was World War II. They had war economy. But that didn't make them all socialists or something. Your analysis is so simplistic that it simply is worthless.
What about the socialization of the media industry, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda?
So all state media is socialist. Got it. All state media is socialism.
A centralized, socialized, state-run construction organization that takes on engineering projects like the autobahns.
So literally you're saying that if the state constructs roads, even that is socialism. Who else is gonna decide where the roads go and where the bridges go and build them if not the state? Yeah, okay, you can build a private road somewhere if you want, if you get a permit. Oh no, you have to get a permit. Is that socialism too? Realistically, infrastructure projects are going to be made by the state. This is exactly what RockingMrE was saying when he said that the entire world is already socialist.
Safe to say that practically every single government in the world today has a socialist economy.
Every single government in the world today has a
He's a moron, my fucking god. Capitalism is the best thing ever, but it never existed.
Comrades, I am happy to announce that we have won. The world is socialist. We live in global socialism.
Public spending on infrastructure. I know it sounds just like Keynesianism.
If this was an April Fool's video, it would be the best shit ever. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if this was all a troll? If this was satire, it would be the best ever. Please let it be true.
How about state-sanctioned looting? You know, like the looting you do during the revolution. The Raumungskommando. In World War II, the British and Americans didn't have repossessions forces, but the Soviet Marxists and the National Socialists did. It's almost like they're singing off the same hymn sheet.
I'm speechless. Like, everything he says, it just keeps getting worse and worse. It's almost as if they're singing from the same hymn sheet. Well, actually, no. Even if they have some superficial similarity, it actually doesn't mean that they're the same. You do realize that, right? And I'm pretty sure, even though I'm not an expert on this topic, I'm pretty sure that the British also had some kind of thing that was responsible for confiscating materials and confiscating resources and things. I know the Finnish military certainly has such a thing. TIK, I'm sorry, but it almost looks like you're trying to force some kind of narrative. I know, crazy, right? In the US Field Manual, 1956, it states, quote, "All enemy public movable property captured or found on a battlefield becomes the property of the capturing state. Enemy private movable property other than arms, military papers, horses, and the like, captured or found on a battlefield may be appropriated only to the extent that such taking is permissible in occupied areas." Unquote. So clearly they also had a procedure for taking people's property. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find these rules for World War II, only for 1956 and later, but it still demonstrates that of course they had some kind of procedure for this. Literally every country does.
What about the attempted socialist revolution? The Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler's failed revolution of...
Oh no, you didn't! You didn't! What the... So, let me get this straight. So, any time someone tries to get power, it's socialism? Holy shit! Anytime anyone tries to commit a putsch, or a coup, or a revolt, or an insurgency, or anything, it's always the dirty, long nails of Marxism lurking behind that thing. This is impossible.
The state railways, nationalised and socialised in 1937.
You mean this? Quote, "It is a fact that the government of the Nazi Party sold off public ownership in several state-owned firms in the mid-1930s. These firms belong to a wide range of sectors: steel, mining, banking, local public utilities, shipyards, ship lines, railways, etc." Unquote. Quote, "Railways. In the 1930s, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, German railways, was the largest single public enterprise in the world, bringing together most of the railway services operating within Germany. The German budget for fiscal year 1934-1935, the last one published, established that railway preference shares worth 224 million Reichsmarks were to be sold. After the First World War, the Reichsbahn had been reorganized as independent institution, and its capital had been formally detached from the Reich property. Within this context, common shares and preference shares were issued. Common shares were direct ownership of the Reich, and most of preferred shares were allocated initially to the Reich. The government could then sell these preferred shares. The Economist, April 7, 1934, besides the sale of the German railway shares, The Economist also mentioned another sale of public property to be done. So, are you talking about the same Deutsche Reichsbahn that they were privatizing? Is that the one you're talking about? TIK has this narrative that he's pushing that Hitler was secretly a Marxist and nobody just wants to admit it. But in reality, it's quite the opposite. He was a capitalist, and he did stuff like privatize industries, but that is actually very rarely talked about. And that's why it doesn't really surprise me that TIK hasn't heard about it. But, I mean, what can you do?
Hitler's social welfare state. Read Ali's Hitler's Beneficiaries for more information, an entire book written about how Hitler's socialism benefited social groups.
So, you still keep insisting that any type of welfare is socialism? Was the Weimar Republic also socialist? Was the German Empire also socialist? Since a lot of these welfare programs date not only from the Weimar Republic, but from even earlier times. Were they already socialist back then? Why do you insist on having such a ridiculous definition of socialism that literally everything from roads to basic welfare to Boy Scouts, it's all socialist somehow? Even trying to overthrow the government is socialist. Everything is socialist.
The belief in the shrinking markets, a socialist concept that is anti-capitalist and leads to the war and the Holocaust as well.
No, I'm sorry, TIK, but you got it backwards. It's not that the concept leads to World War II, it's that the reality of this fact of the falling rate of profit, that is what led to World War II. And this concept is merely something that's trying to explain this fact. What you're saying is basically that until gravity was invented, we were all just floating around. But then some asshole invented gravity and now we have to walk, we can't fly anymore. No, the fact was already there. Then Marx analyzed it, and Rosa Luxemburg analyzed it, and they came up with theories and concepts and names for things. But the fact was already there. German capitalists had economic reasons and economic interests, and there were objective economic features and objective economic laws, which put strong pressure on them to start preparing for colonial expansion. You can't say that because economists discovered this fact and pointed it out, that it's therefore their fault. TIK truly thinks that ideas just pop into people's heads out of nowhere, and then that makes the world go around. No, people get their ideas, and yeah, I am a Marxist, I know, but whatever. I believe in materialism. People look at the world around them, they see things happening, and that's where their ideas come from. It's not the other way around. I don't just randomly get ideas from nowhere, and then I somehow project the world out of my mind. No, the world is there, I look at it, I get ideas. The German capitalists had incentive for colonial plunder, and out of that fact, theories began to emerge for why that is. The problem is not that people analyzed that reality and came up with theories. The problem is that there was a system in place where that was the reality. You understand what I'm saying? I hope so. If you want to hear some real peak idealism, this is it. He doesn't even realize it, but he's literally saying that the only reason World War II happened was because Hitler was a crazy man with a stupid theory. If only Hitler didn't believe in a silly theory, the whole war wouldn't have happened. That's why, before Hitler came along, and before Hitler had his stupid theory, there were no wars whatsoever. World War I never happened. No other wars like this ever happened.
a central, nationalised and socialised state bank controlled by the government.
Bakunin, where are you when I need you? Come here and call Hitler a Jew for having a national bank.
Now, yes, this was actually nationalised prior to Hitler's coming to power.
Yeah, like everything else. Like the healthcare and the railways, which then Hitler privatized.
But he didn't privatise it, did he? If he was a capitalist, he would have.
There's one thing he didn't privatize, so therefore he wasn't a capitalist. Again, like, are you gonna say that because the US has the Federal Reserve, it is a socialist country? You have got to be kidding me. Because they have a national bank, they're somehow socialist? Like, what happened to the... You had a definition of socialism, but now it's all gone out the window. Now it's all just, oh, they have a national bank, therefore it's socialism. Like, whatever the government does stuff, it's socialist. There is no logical consistency in this video.
How about the abolishment of private property under the Reichstag fire decree of 1933?
Okay.
Article 115, the dwelling of every German is his sanctuary and is inviolable. This is struck off. The state can walk into your home for any reason and there's nothing you can do about it.
First of all, the state can already do whatever the fuck they want. What are you gonna do, like call the police? Like, they issued a decree and therefore private property no longer exists in Germany. Except it still existed though. What is this idealism? Just because they say, oh, by the way, private property no longer exists, therefore that makes it true. No, it doesn't work like that. Why didn't Stalin just issue a decree? Private property no longer exists. And then, voila, it's magically true, it no longer exists. Why did he have to go through this, 10 years of collectivizing everything? Why didn't he just do it like Hitler and just publish a decree? Just publish a decree, guys. That makes reality. This is my paper crown. And on this paper crown, I have written the word Golden Crown of the King of Finland. So now when I wear this, Finland is transformed into a monarchy, and I am its king. Reality doesn't work like that. The fact is, private property still existed in Germany. It was never abolished. They didn't do anything to abolish it. Quite the contrary. They privatized things, as I've already stated numerous times. In order to actually abolish private property, they would have had to collectivize the farms and socialize all the factories, but they didn't though, so...
Yes, by law, individuals could no longer own property. Everything belongs to society.
I refuse to believe that you actually believe this. You can't be serious.
The state can seize your property at any moment it wishes to do so.
Yeah, whereas currently they totally can't do that, right? No, they can totally do that. They can do whatever the fuck they want. Capitalist states confiscate people's assets and people's money and people's property all the time. Nowhere in this does it say that you are not allowed to own property anymore. That's just laughable. They were still very able to own property. Yeah, the state could confiscate it if they want, because that's what states do when they want to. But most of the time, the state didn't confiscate the capitalist property. I guess that's the real difference, isn't it? In socialist countries, the state does confiscate the capitalist's property, and in capitalist countries, it typically doesn't. Isn't that the difference?
Many Marxists claim that the National Socialists privatized the industries. They state that the word privatization was invented by the National Socialists, and thus proves that Hitler was a capitalist. You know, because these people say you can't take the Nazis at their word when they include socialism in the name of their party, but that you can take them at their word when they call the socialization of the industries privatization.
First of all, it's not so much that they call it privatization, it's just that it is privatization. We don't really care what it's called. It could be called pink elephants or something. It is privatization when you take something that is publicly owned and then you make it privately owned. That is privatization, is it not? And I believe that the Nazis didn't call it that. It was analysts abroad who were looking at what Hitler was doing, you know, making public things private, and they coined the term privatization referring to what Hitler was doing. Hitler himself didn't invent the term. Quote, Sweezy again uses the concept when giving concrete examples of transference of government ownership to private hands. The United Steel Trust is an outstanding example of reprivatization. This may be the first use of the term reprivatization in the academic literature in English, at least within the domain of the social sciences. Hans Wolfgang Singer used the term in The German War Economy, Part 7, published in The Economic Journal in 1942. Singer reported the claims by German officials that the new policy was to, quote, produce more and organize less, and, quote, in pursuance of reprivatization, factories and machine tools, which were previously only leased to private businessmen, are now to be sold to them. In 1943, Sidney Merlin published Trends in German Economic Control since 1933 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Merlin agrees that Germany's National Socialist Party was looking not only for business support, but also for increased Nazi control over the economy. Quote, the party, moreover, facilitates the accumulation of private fortunes and industrial empires by its foremost members and collaborators through privatization and other measures, thereby intensifying centralization of economic affairs and government in an increasingly narrow group that may, for all practical purposes, be termed the National Socialist elite. Unquote. Merlin was aware of Sweezy's work, but instead of reprivatization, he used the term privatization, which may be the first time this term is used in the social science literature in English. Unquote.
They're ignoring absolutely everything else I've just mentioned, and they're distorting the truth.
What you have said so far has been fairly meaningless. Like, all you have said is they had roads, and they had a national bank, and they had Nazi Boy Scouts, therefore it's socialist. How is that a compelling argument? Every significant country in the modern world has those things. Well, minus the Nazi Boy Scouts maybe, they just have some other type of Boy Scouts. They have a national bank, and they have roads, and they have welfare. It doesn't matter. That's not what makes a country socialist or not. What makes a country socialist is having all the factories and all the enterprises and all the farms and everything owned by the society as a whole, owned by the public sector. That's why we talk about privatization. Because if you privatize enterprises, then obviously they're not public anymore. Can't be socialist. This is not some crazy complicated argument we're making. We're just saying if you make all these public enterprises private now, then it's not socialist.
However, let's assume that this was true for a moment, that Hitler gave the big industries back to the private sector. All that would do is prove that Hitler wasn't a Marxist socialist.
What? Well, no, it would prove that he is a capitalist, that he is not a socialist at all, right? How would you define socialism? Like, please explain how you define socialism then. If even handing public sector things to the private sector is somehow compatible with socialism, then how on earth do you define socialism?
What he's actually done is given the industries back to the German people.
He has given it to a small handful of bankers and capitalists. Millionaires, industrialists, investors, not the German people. This is not East Germany, this is Nazi Germany. In East Germany, the stuff belonged to the German people, since it was societally owned, it was socialist. But in Nazi Germany, it belonged to capitalists.
He is a racial socialist, not a class socialist.
No, fucking Bakunin was a racial socialist. Hitler wasn't. Please tell me this is a joke. Please. For the love of God.
Why do we need all that socialization of the banks and factories?
Spoken like a true socialist.
We are socializing the people.
Maybe he genuinely believes this. Like, this is the thing. Strasser was more economically left than Hitler was. Strasser wanted to actually severely restrict private property. He still didn't want to abolish it, but he did want to severely restrict it. Hitler disagreed. He said, why do we need all that socialization? Isn't it enough that we just regulate things? We are socializing the people. That just doesn't fall under anybody else's definition of socialism except Hitler's. Yeah, I'm a Newtonian, but I don't believe in gravity. I just like the label Newtonian, I just like it, but I don't believe in gravity. I don't believe in Newtonian physics, that's nonsense. You see how that doesn't make any sense?